You won't believe how far the HOA went this time. They actually called the cops on me to try and take control of my private forest. But they picked the wrong guy to mess with. This isn't just any forest, it's a 180-year-old piece of land that's been in my family for generations. And thanks to a deal my great-grandfather made long ago, the HOA is legally banned from touching it for 99 years. Yeah, they didn't see that coming. Most folks wouldn't understand how something like this could even happen. I mean, you buy a piece of land, your name's on the deed, and you live your life. Right? Well, not when there's an HOA involved. The thing is, my property sits on the edge of a beautiful lake, with views that could be on postcards. The land includes a dense patch of old forest, untouched, rich with history, and teeming with life. It's got deer trails, wild berry bushes, and a tiny, hidden stream that's been running since the Civil War days. Every kid in my family has played in those woods, climbed those trees, and caught frogs in that creek. It's not just land, it's a legacy. And because my great-grandfather had the foresight to protect it, there's a legally binding historical preservation agreement tied to the deed. It says that the forest can't be sold, developed, or altered in any way by anyone, including any HOA, for a full 99 years starting from the date of the agreement. That clock still has 14 years left on it. But none of that seemed to matter to Karen. Karen is the head of the local HOA, and I swear she thinks she's the mayor of the entire town. She's the kind of woman who walks around with a clipboard, writing down violations, like someone's trash bin being visible from the street or a flower pot being the wrong color. She's always had her eye on my forest, even though it's not part of the HOA neighborhood. That's right, my land isn't under the HOA at all. My driveway connects to the same road, but the forest and the house were built long before the HOA ever existed. Still, that hasn't stopped Karen from trying to claim otherwise. It all started subtly. First, she sent a letter inviting me to an HOA planning meeting to discuss improvements to shared community spaces. I ignored it. Then she sent another, this time referring to my forest as the East Woodland Zone. That's when I knew she was up to something. I responded with a copy of my deed and the legal documentation, reminding her in writing that the land was private and protected. You'd think that would be enough. It wasn't. Next, Karen showed up at my doorstep with 2 HOA board members. She said they wanted to survey the forest and inspect its safety compliance. I laughed. I told them that the land didn't belong to the HOA and they had no right to step foot on it. They left, but I saw them walking the edge of the forest later that day, holding a clipboard and pointing at trees like they were planning a renovation project. I took pictures, just in case I'd need proof. A week later, Karen sent a letter claiming the forest had unmanaged undergrowth and posed a potential wildfire hazard to the neighborhood. She cited some HOA bylaw and claimed it gave them the authority to intervene. That was when I knew things were about to escalate. I consulted a property attorney who specialized in land disputes. He read everything and assured me that not only was I in the right, but the HOA had zero legal standing. Still, he advised me to keep detailed records and prepare for trouble. Trouble came in the form of flashing red and blue lights. I was sitting on my porch one morning when 2 sheriff's deputies pulled into my driveway. I greeted them calmly and asked what was going on. They said someone had reported that I was blocking access to public land and refusing safety inspections. I knew exactly who called. I invited the deputies inside and showed them everything, the land deed, the preservation contract, the historical maps, and the county seals stamped on the documents. They read through it all carefully. One of them even radioed in to verify the legal files with county records. After about 15 minutes, the lead deputy walked back to his cruiser, came back with a notepad, and wrote something down. Then he turned to Karen, who had appeared on the sidewalk across the street with her arms folded like she was about to witness justice. Instead, the deputy walked up to her and said, "Ma'am, this is private land. It's protected under historical preservation laws. You and the HOA have no authority over it. If you step foot on it again, it will be considered trespassing. You should have seen her face. It went from smug to shocked in a split second. She tried to argue, saying the forest was part of the extended neighborhood and that the community had a right to clean and beautify shared spaces. But the deputy wasn't having it. He shut her down and told her she was lucky I hadn't pressed charges for the earlier trespass. Karen walked away without saying another word, but I knew she wasn't done. Something about the way she looked back at the trees told me she still had plans. Plans that were going to get a lot messier before they ended. That was just the beginning. It all started just days after the sheriff's visit. I thought Karen would back off after being told directly by law enforcement that the HOA had no rights over my land. But clearly, being publicly embarrassed only made her double down. One morning, I walked out to grab the paper and saw a group of HOA members gathered at the edge of the forest. They had tape measures, spray paint, and were staking little orange flags into the ground. I marched down there and asked what the hell they were doing. One of the board members, a guy named Phil who never speaks unless Karen is within 5 feet of him, mumbled something about plotting the Greenbelt expansion. I told them again, firmly, that this forest was not part of their jurisdiction, and if they didn't pack up and leave, I'd call the sheriff myself this time. Karen wasn't there, but I knew this had her fingerprints all over it. They slowly packed up and left, but not before marking a few trees with orange X's. That infuriated me. These trees had stood longer than the HOA had even existed. Some of them were likely planted before cars were invented. And now they were trying to tag them for removal like it was some weekend yard cleanup. The very next day, a printed HOA newsletter was dropped into every mailbox in the neighborhood, including mine. The front page had a headline that said, "Exciting forest beautification plans coming soon." Beneath it was a crudely drawn map showing trails, benches, a so-called community garden, and even a gazebo, all right in the middle of my forest. They had redrawn the boundaries of the neighborhood and included my land as community-owned green space. The article claimed that the HOA board had voted unanimously to incorporate underused surrounding property into shared amenities, and that the transition would begin immediately. I nearly choked on my coffee. Not only was it completely false, but it was also written in a way that made it seem like I had agreed to the changes. There was even a line that said, "We thank the property owner for their cooperation in helping the community grow together." That was it. I wasn't going to let this woman lie to the neighborhood and railroad me into submission. I printed out copies of my deed, the historical land agreement, and a letter from the county confirming the forest's protected status. Then I went door to door. I knocked on every house that got the newsletter and calmly explained the truth, that the forest was not HOA land, that no changes were permitted, and that Karen's so-called vote was a complete fabrication. Most of the neighbors were shocked. A few were embarrassed. Many had assumed the forest was part of the HOA because of how often Karen talked about it like it was hers to manage. Once they saw the documents, the tide began to turn. But Karen wasn't done. She filed a formal request with the county to have the land re-evaluated as community property under a loophole she believed existed in the original preservation deal. The thing is, that deal was airtight. My great-grandfather didn't just write it up on a napkin, he filed it through a state-approved historical trust, and the forest had been on several environmental surveys since then. The county declined her request within 2 days. But by then, she'd already posted flyers about a community forest cleanup day, scheduled for the following Saturday. Volunteers were encouraged to bring gloves, rakes, pruning shears, and positive energy. I showed up early that morning and parked my truck across the only narrow trail leading into the woods. Then I set up a camera on a tripod and waited. Sure enough, around 10 a.m., a group of about 15 people started arriving. Most were regular homeowners who genuinely believed they were helping out. A few had even brought their kids. I greeted them politely and handed out a one-page flyer with the title, "This forest is private and protected, here's why you shouldn't enter." People started reading. Confusion turned into discomfort. And one by one, they started walking away. A few apologized. One man even thanked me for taking care of the land and said his daughter had always loved looking at the forest from their backyard. Within 30 minutes, the event fizzled out, except for Karen. She showed up late, wearing a reflective vest and carrying a clipboard like she was managing a construction site. When she saw my truck blocking the path, she looked like she was about to explode. She marched right up to me and barked, "You can't stop community volunteers from doing good." I stayed calm and pointed to the camera. "Karen, you're being recorded. You've ignored multiple legal notices, county letters, and even a direct warning from the sheriff. If you step onto this land again, I will file a restraining order." She stood there, jaw clenched, eyes darting to the camera, then to the neighbors watching from their porches. Finally, she turned around and walked away, but not before saying, "You think you've won? We'll see about that." Later that day, she sent an email blast claiming I had threatened volunteers and used intimidation tactics to prevent a harmless neighborhood event. I forwarded her message to my attorney, the sheriff's department, and the county land office. This time, the county issued an official cease and desist order against the HOA, citing their repeated attempts to alter protected property and their distribution of false claims. They were warned that any further action could result in civil penalties. The line had been drawn, and Karen had crossed it too many times. She had underestimated not only the law but the power of documented truth and a community that finally began to see through her lies. What started as a land grab attempt was quickly becoming something bigger. And I wasn't done fighting. Karen's next move wasn't just bold, it was borderline delusional. After being warned by the sheriff, shut down by the county, and called out by multiple neighbors, you'd think she'd quit while she was ahead. But no, she decided it was time to double down with a full-scale propaganda campaign. The very next week, new HOA signs popped up on lampposts and street corners, including one right near the forest trailhead. It read, "Welcome to Karen's Path to Peace, a community nature experience." I had to rub my eyes. Was this woman serious? Not only had she named a walking trail after herself, she'd done it on land that she legally had no right to touch. That's when I realized this wasn't just about land anymore, it was about pride. Karen wasn't fighting to benefit the neighborhood, she was fighting because she hated being told no. And she wasn't working alone anymore. She'd somehow convinced a couple of new board members, some folks I'd never even spoken to, that my forest was abandoned and underutilized. One of them, a guy named Rick, even told a group of neighbors during a meeting that I was sitting on a hidden goldmine of real estate potential. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from forest beautification to economic benefit. They claimed the neighborhood could substantially increase property values if the area was turned into a park, picnic site, or even an HOA-maintained nature preserve. I guess it never crossed their minds that you can't raise value by stealing someone else's property. At this point, I knew Karen was trying to rewrite the story before people could figure out the truth. So I decided to go public. I contacted a local historian who had worked with the county on preserving historical landmarks. He agreed to come out and document the land. Within a week, he published a small article in the local newspaper about the forest's unique ecosystem, the family legacy behind it, and the preservation clause signed in 1940 that kept it protected. The story included photos of century-old trees, a description of the rare plant species, and even an old black and white photo of my great-grandfather standing next to one of the large oaks, holding a rifle and a pocket watch. That article changed everything. People who had never paid attention suddenly started asking questions. A local teacher reached out and asked if her class could visit the forest for a nature walk. I agreed, as long as they stayed on the marked trail and didn't disturb the land. We ended up having a small educational day, complete with birdwatching, a talk about conservation, and a lesson in local history. Photos from the event made it onto the school district's website. More importantly, it made the HOA look petty. While they were busy putting up fake trail signs, I was helping educate children and honor the land's legacy. Of course, this only made Karen angrier. The next email she sent out accused me of using the land for personal gain and claimed I was commercializing a community resource without permission. She didn't even bother trying to sound reasonable anymore. Her emails were getting desperate, full of exaggerated claims and wild accusations. One day she even posted on the HOA's online portal that she was organizing a petition to take legal custody of the forest. That's when I knew things were going to get uglier. I contacted my lawyer again. This time, we drafted a formal cease and desist letter, citing harassment, trespassing, defamation, and abuse of HOA resources. We also included a demand that the HOA remove all signage, flyers, and digital references to my forest within 10 business days. We sent copies to the HOA board, the county, and the sheriff's office. That move hit them like a thunderclap. Within a few days, the signs disappeared, the newsletters stopped, and Karen's online posts were deleted. But it didn't end there. Karen went quiet for a full week, and then I received a notice in the mail, a summons to small claims court. Karen was suing me. According to her claim, I had caused emotional distress, damaged the spirit of the community, and prevented peaceful enjoyment of nature. She was seeking $3,000 in damages and an injunction to allow limited HOA oversight of the forest. I couldn't believe it. I laughed when I read it, but my lawyer told me to take it seriously. So, I did. I prepared everything. I printed every document, every photo, every letter. I even printed screenshots of her emails and flyers. I was ready. Court day arrived and the room was packed. Apparently, word had gotten around the neighborhood, and people wanted to see what would happen. Karen showed up dressed like she was going to church, clutching a binder full of documents. She started her argument with a long speech about unity and healing nature. She talked about how she envisioned a trail where kids could learn about trees and neighbors could gather under the sunset. The judge listened politely. Then it was my turn. I laid everything out, the land deed, the historical preservation agreement, the sheriff's report, the county letter, photos of Karen's fake trail signs, screenshots of her inflammatory posts, and the cease and desist letter she ignored. The judge took one look at the agreement from 1940 and said, "This land is not yours, it never was, and you had no right to act otherwise." Case dismissed. Karen didn't say a word. She just picked up her binder, turned around, and walked out. The courtroom burst into quiet murmurs. A few neighbors even smiled and gave me thumbs up. That day, everything changed. Karen had embarrassed herself beyond repair. She lost credibility, authority, and support. The HOA board quickly distanced themselves from her and later voted her out as president. They issued a public apology and promised to revise their policies to prevent something like this from happening again. For the first time in months, I felt peace again. Not just in the forest, but in the neighborhood too. After the courtroom drama ended, you'd think that would be the final chapter, but stories like these don't wrap up neatly. Even though Karen was officially removed as president of the HOA, and the case had been dismissed by the judge in less than 20 minutes, there was still fallout to deal with. The lies she had spread, the confusion she had caused, and the damage to community trust didn't just vanish overnight. Some people were still unsure what had happened, and a few of her loyal followers kept whispering rumors that I'd cheated the system or used loopholes to win. But I didn't let any of that bother me. I knew the truth, and now, so did the law. More importantly, the majority of the neighborhood now saw Karen for who she really was, a manipulative woman obsessed with control, willing to bend the rules, twist facts, and trample boundaries to get her way. In the weeks following the court case, life slowly returned to normal. The fake trail signs were gone. The orange flags and spray paint on the trees had been cleaned up. I even found an anonymous note in my mailbox that read, "Sorry for believing her. The forest is beautiful, thank you for protecting it." It wasn't signed, but I appreciated it. I could finally walk my property without feeling like I was being watched or judged. Birds returned to the trees, and the sounds of chainsaws and HOA meetings faded into the background. I didn't want to hold grudges, and I certainly didn't want to become like Karen. But I also knew I couldn't just pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. So I decided to do something proactive, something to make the forest more than just a source of stress and legal battles. I reached out to the local high school's environmental science club and invited them to use the forest for research and educational trips. With supervision and guidelines, of course. They jumped at the chance. Soon, students were visiting regularly, studying tree species, soil composition, and wildlife habitats. It brought life back to the forest, the right kind of life. That small effort sparked more positive change than I could have imagined. A local newspaper did a follow-up article on the court case and highlighted the student projects, calling the forest a symbol of standing firm for what's right. Even the county's preservation office sent a letter of thanks, noting that landowners who maintain historical property with care and respect deserve recognition. I had that letter framed and hung in my hallway. Despite all this, Karen's presence didn't entirely disappear. Although she was no longer on the HOA board, she still lived 2 blocks away, and every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of her walking her dog near the edge of my land. She never spoke, never made eye contact. Just glared silently, as if she was still hoping the trees would fall over in protest. But the trees stood tall, unmoved and unbothered. One day, months later, a new HOA president named Grace knocked on my door. She was polite, soft-spoken, and came with a peace offering, a small potted plant and a handwritten note that said, "Let's work together, not against each other." We sat on my porch and talked for nearly an hour. She acknowledged everything that had happened and assured me the HOA had no intention of ever trying to claim the land again. She even asked if I'd be willing to speak at their next board meeting to explain the historical importance of the forest and answer questions from members who were still confused. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to put a final period at the end of this messy chapter. At the meeting, I brought copies of the original preservation documents, historical photos, and even a laminated map showing the forest boundary. I explained how the land had been in my family for generations, how the legal protection was still valid for 14 more years, and how important it was to keep honoring that legacy. Some people nodded with understanding, others just listened quietly, but no one argued. When I finished, Grace stood and said, "Let's never let power blind us to the truth again." That earned a round of quiet applause. Afterward, several neighbors approached me, not just to apologize but to offer help. One couple volunteered to build a rustic sign near the forest entrance that explained its history. Another offered to plant native flowers along the road leading to the trail. What had started as an attempted land grab had, in a strange twist, united the community around something real. Something older and more meaningful than any HOA rulebook could ever touch. Looking back now, the whole ordeal feels surreal. A woman tried to take something that didn't belong to her, not because she needed it, but because she couldn't stand the idea that someone else had something she couldn't control. That mindset nearly turned a peaceful neighborhood into a battlefield. But what stopped it wasn't just laws and courtrooms. It was persistence, truth, and the quiet support of good people who were willing to see past the noise. The forest remains untouched, and the preservation contract still stands. When the 99-year mark finally comes around, my plan is to renew it. I'll pass the deed and the story down to my kids, just like my great-grandfather passed it to me. They'll know what happened here, how one woman tried to erase a legacy with lies and manipulation, and how a community came together to defend what was right. Because in the end, the forest didn't just survive, it became stronger. Not because of fences or locks, but because of people finally choosing to stand up to power, to speak truth, and to respect something bigger than themselves. And that's a story worth telling for generations.